Hi Tony, I'm the mass analyst. Bravo, bravo on a hoax well done. Now, for those of my viewers who don't have any idea about what I'm talking about, let me just recap. Tony, who goes by the name of Thewinekone, is one of the more popular YouTube users. In fact, he's a partner. Now, he started out producing very PG-13 type videos. Very funny, very amusing, quite popular and entertaining. Recently, his videos, some of his videos have had a more edgy feel to it. Certainly not PG-13 by any stretch of the imagination, touching on such subjects as sexuality and bestiality and a much creepier sense of humor than before. Well, a few days ago he made a video in which he purportedly read a letter that was sent to him from YouTube or Google, in which they threatened to censor him. And so it looked like he was being censored by YouTube or Google. In fact, there was no such letter sent to him. He just made it up out of thin air. And as a result, he fooled a fair number of people into thinking that YouTube was putting the hammer down on him. I'm posting a link to his video, and I encourage you to watch him, and you'll see what I'm saying is true, that he did fool a lot of people, and job well done. But you're missing an important lesson if you don't ask yourself, why did so many people fall for my hoax? Why was it so successful? I think there's some valuable lessons that you can learn here, or that we can learn here. And they touch on such subjects as the War of the Worlds, Renetto, possible government censorship on YouTube. Now you're probably sitting back and saying, hey, wait, what? What are you talking about, Mass Analyst? You're going, what's this about the Thewinekone and War of the Worlds and government censorship on YouTube? Huh? Well, seeing how this is almost a Halloween season, it's time for a little tale. Back in 1938, Orson Welles did a rebroadcast of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. Probably most of you are familiar with the story. Now, there was one important difference between the radio broadcasts and the original novel. In the original novel, the Martians landed in England, and in the radio broadcast, they had the Martians landing in Grover Mills, New Jersey. The radio broadcast started out announcing that they were enacting a drama, that this was not a real newscast. But a lot of people turned in late to the broadcast, and they didn't hear this announcement. The radio broadcast seemed fairly realistic to a bunch of people, to a lot of people, because it started out with an orchestra playing. They were playing big band music at the time, and they broke into it with a flash announcement, announcing that cylinders or meteors had fallen, and they weren't sure what was going on. And then they went back to music, and there was a series of further news announcements, and it sounded to the people at the time very realistic. In fact, the broadcasters had actually studied the announcers of the Hindenburg disaster a few years prior to that to listen to their style in order to make it sound more realistic. Well, the aftermath is thousands of people heard this, and despite being told at the beginning, and despite several warnings throughout the broadcast that this was a drama, a significant number of people didn't hear the warnings, and they panicked. People went out into the streets. They inundated the police departments, the fire departments with thousands of phone calls. It would be an exaggeration to call this mass hysteria. It wasn't on that grand a scale, but a significant number of people heard this, they believed it, and panicked. Several people fainted. And as a result of all this, there was some call for some censorship of the radio. In fact, it started a bit of a debate back then. Now, the bottom line is the FCC commissioner called in the head of the three national broadcasting networks, and he told them that he thought their use of the word flash to introduce news stories was overused. And the three network heads, fearing government regulation, further regulation, they voluntarily agreed not to use the word flash unless they were introducing a real story of utmost importance. Now, at the time, there were about, I think, 600 letters were sent to the FCC. Most of them, or at least a slight majority at least, were in favor of further censorship. They said, hey, these guys are being irresponsible, you can't let them get away with this, and they wanted the news station held accountable. The other, not quite half, said, hey, it's a new medium, you have to be careful about censorship. You start censoring that and you will really impact what this new medium can do. Fortunately, there was no further regulations instituted upon the medium of radio, although there was one senator at least who did call for further regulation. In fact, he said that he had a bill that he was going to introduce which would give the FCC the right to examine and censor all radio programs before they went on the air. Fortunately, he never did introduce this bill, possibly because there was quite an outcry in the newspaper editorials against the censorship. But the specter of government censorship did raise its head in the aftermath of the War of the Worlds scandal. Now, interesting question is, why did so many people believe what was an obvious hoax? Remember, this was broadcast on Halloween's Eve. That in itself maybe should have been a little bit of a clue that, hey, you have to be careful what you're listening to. Well, I've done a bit of reading on this, and I see three possible explanations as to why so many people panic. I'm not really sure whether any one of these explanations is the cause. Maybe it's a combination of all three. Maybe some other factor that neither I nor anyone else has considered. I'm not really sure. You can judge for yourself why people panic. But the first two explanations are sort of interrelated. Remember, this happened on October 30th, 1938. Now, for you history whizzes, you might think, oh, October 30th, 1938, what was happening back then? Well, only a month before then, very important news had been happening. Just about everyone was afraid that a world war was on the horizon. The Germans within Czechoslovakia, the people in the Sudetenland, really wanted to become part of Germany. They didn't want to become part of Czechoslovakia. Hitler was eyeing Czechoslovakia. He was thinking about invading it, or so it seemed. And if he invaded Czechoslovakia, that would promulgate a world war. And people were very, very much afraid of this. And so there were negotiations that occurred back then, in the Munich crisis, it was called. And bottom line was, Sudetenland was given to the Germans, and Hitler promised to be a nice guy, and everyone was happy for a few months. A great misreading of what would happen. But keep in mind that people thought that they had just dodged a bullet, that maybe war wouldn't break out, but they were still a bit edgy. Now, the time between the negotiations and the War of the World broadcast was only like a 3 or 4 week period. And during those 3 or 4 weeks, more radios had been sold. It was a brand new medium. More radios had been sold during that time period than any other time period. People were buying it specifically, the radio specifically, to listen in on the conference, to listen in and see what was happening in the world, because they were so afraid of war. So you had on the one hand the general environment. People were sort of primed, I guess you could say, to panic, or primed for bad news, primed for a war. And some people may have just heard reports of gas attacks, and they didn't even realize perhaps it was the Martians, and they thought maybe Germans were on the march. Who knows? But people were sort of panicky. The other intertwined reason, is that radio was such a new medium that people didn't have any sort of experience with hoaxes on the radio. they just got done listening to broadcasts from the Munich conference, and they were used to hearing the broadcast, flash broadcast. And so when they heard the term flash, we interrupt for a special bulletin, something along those lines, they thought it was real. So those are two possible explanations. Third possible explanation is that anytime you broadcast to a large number of people, to thousands and thousands or hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, whatever, you're going to get a small percentage that are just plain stupid or just a little bit slow. It's just the law of averages. You're going to get some people that are just not the sharpest tacks in the drawer, or the sharpest knives in the drawer. And I think that's what you probably had here, is that you got some people who weren't too quick-witted. And even if you have a degree, that doesn't necessarily mean you're quick-witted or sharp. As I mentioned earlier, a couple of geologists from Princeton ended up going out to try and find out what was going on. They went meteor hunting, thinking that something real was happening. Now, interestingly enough, in 1974, after there's a long history of radio, people are much more sophisticated, you would think, in 1974. They couldn't possibly fall for something like this again. I mean, everybody knows the story of the War of the Worlds broadcast and what happened and how people panicked. Well, believe it or not, in Rhode Island, on Halloween's Eve again, to commemorate the War of the World broadcast, and they did announce at the beginning that this was a reenactment. They reenacted the War of the Worlds with location names closer to Providence, Rhode Island, where this was being broadcast. And the radio station was flooded with 100 phone calls, and 80 people called the police with their concerns. And it wasn't a panic on the scale of the War of the Worlds original broadcast by any means. It was very small in comparison. But you also have to remember that this was a local radio broadcast. It wasn't a national broadcast. There was a much smaller audience. So one wonders if this had been and it was also at 11 p.m. rather than the original, which I think was at 8 p.m. So you had a much, much smaller audience listening to the broadcast. And it was on Halloween's night. But still, to have that many people, you have to wonder if this had been broadcast nationally at 8 p.m., you wonder whether you might have had something similar to the scale of the original War of the Worlds. Who knows? I don't know which of these three factors was the most important. I think that probably all of them contribute to the explanation, and I don't think you can dismiss any one of the factors. So some of you may be thinking right now, hey, masked analyst, that was sort of an interesting story, and if it were being told by someone who could deliver it without tripping over his tongue, or who had an ounce of stage presence, that might be an even more interesting story. But what the hell does that have to do with government regulation, and how does it relate to the Thewinekone hoax? Well, one of the reasons that people may believe the War of the World was the environment in which it was told. The nation was on edge, and people were jittery. And, well, the environment within YouTube, whether fair or not, a lot of people believe that YouTube is censoring videos. Certainly a lot of people have been suspended from YouTube without actually knowing why or given precise reasons as to why they're suspended. There's a lot of anger right now, and I'm going to post a link in the sidebar to some videos by Renetto. A lot of people are unhappy that YouTube is making what appears to be arbitrary decisions. They may not be arbitrary, but certainly from people looking at it from the outside, it appears to be arbitrary decisions as to suspending accounts and pulling videos. Now, some of the videos they remove, a lot of them they remove, their hands are sort of forced by the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the DMCA. And I say sort of forced because it doesn't really force them to take down any videos. If anyone tells you that they have to take a video down because the DMCA forces them to, well, they're outright lying. That's all there is to it. It doesn't force them to do it. What the DMCA does is it says, okay, Internet providers, okay YouTube or any other service like YouTube, here are some steps that you can take. And if you take these steps, we'll make sure that no one can sue you successfully in court for copyright infringement. And it lists the steps. And one of the steps, the main step being that if someone files a DMCA complaint, YouTube has to take down the video within, I think it's 10 to 14, I forget the exact number, but a certain number of business days they have to take down the video. And then if someone files a counterclaim, then YouTube has to put the video back up. This is just a very, very short explanation. But YouTube is not absolutely required. If YouTube was willing to risk the lawsuits, they could certainly, if they wanted to value fair use, there's nothing in the law that says that they can't keep the videos up if they wanted to enforce a fair use regime. But because of their risk assessment, they have instituted a policy to take down videos. So some of it, a portion of this can't be blamed on YouTube. A portion of this is just bad regulation that I started talking about, and at some other point I may go into it in more detail. But there's certainly nothing within the DMCA that requires YouTube to suspend a person, and especially it doesn't require them to suspend a person indefinitely. And I'll post a link in the sidebar to a blog post by Wendy Seltzer, who's an expert on it, a legal expert on this matter, and she says that YouTube is not required. Well, she doesn't specifically refer to YouTube, but to a similar sort of situation, which says that permanent suspensions or permanent punishments really not required by the DMCA. But whatever the DMCA calls for or doesn't call for, there's certainly the perception that YouTube is being unfair in the way they're enforcing their rules, and unfair in that there's no appeal, that people don't really know where they stand. They don't know who's going to be next when the hammer drops, and nobody wants to be suspended permanently. So there's certainly a wide-scale perception on this. I'm going to post a link in the sidebar to a video by Renetto, and so you can actually see the form that some of this discontent is taking place. Now, Renetto, I'm not in favor of a blanket amnesty for everybody who's suspended from YouTube. YouTube has had valid reasons to suspend some people, but Renetto makes a very valid point. If people are going to be suspended right and left, then YouTube really ought to at least send them a detailed explanation as to why they're suspended, specifically what video got them suspended, or videos, exactly what rule was broken. It's only common courtesy, common business sense for a business like YouTube to have reasons to suspend people, to document those reasons, and to let the people know. Now, it's possible that YouTube might not want to do this because of confidentiality reasons, if say they don't want to let the person know who may have quote-unquote ratted on them. Okay, but they could at least make generalizations. They don't have to let the person know specifically who informed on them. So Renetto does raise a good point. They ought to at least let people know why their account was suspended, and let the people who've been suspended have a chance to make a counter-argument. There should be some sort of appeal process, at least if you're going to suspend someone for life or permanently. Or maybe one shouldn't even have suspensions for life except for the most egregious offenses. So there's a lot of anger out there. It's in this sort of atmosphere of mistrust that you released your video hoax, Tony, in which you claimed, or you made it look like, YouTube was about to drop the censorship hammer down upon you. And that's why so many people believed you, and that's why you were able to fool them. Now, there is sort of another parallel between what happened here and the War of the Worlds. And I say sort of because I am grasping at straws a little bit. I'm reaching a little bit here. But in the aftermath of the War of the Worlds scandal, there was a sizable outcry amongst people calling for the censorship of radio insisting that they be more responsible. And as I mentioned, there was one senator who even threatened to introduce legislation that would give the FCC the power to censor broadcasts before they happened. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, and the industry ended up being self-regulating. Well, I'm not saying that there's going to be call for more censorship on YouTube. That's not the parallel. But what I am saying is that there very well may be calls amongst people to have government regulation of YouTube if YouTube can't clean up its act. Now, I prefer not to go down that route. I'm more of a market-oriented person myself, and theoretically, economics theory would say that if the producer or the manufacturer or a company is abusing its customers, as YouTube it seems to be abusing, and I'm not saying they are, I'm just saying they seem to be. There's the appearance of this. A lot of people believe it. I'm not saying it's their intent to abuse people, but if they seem to be abusing people and not treating them fairly, then classical economic theory says that a competitor is going to start up, and people will migrate to that competitor, and YouTube will lose the war in the marketplace. There are a few problems with this, however. It might be very hard for a competitor to leap into the market because YouTube is such a head start. And I want to go over a few arguments that I can't say is original. I want to give props to Don't Clown Yourself, because he raised some of these points in some correspondence with me, and I think he made some very good points. Probably most of you are too young to remember, but there used to be, when VHS tapes first came out, there used to be two standards, the VHS and the Betamax. And VHS had a head start. Now, a lot of people thought that Betamax was a superior technology, but it didn't make it in the marketplace because VHS did get a head start. I don't know how long a head start, but probably a few years head start. And people were buying the VHS players, and because people had VHS players which couldn't play the Betamax tapes, even though many people thought that Betamax was a superior technology, it just never caught on and it died. Well, we might be seeing a sort of similar situation with YouTube right now. YouTube is so popular, they've developed a massive database. Now, it's possible that someone like Microsoft might jump in and try and be a competitor, but they have some disadvantages. YouTube is very popular, as I mentioned. They have a massive, massive video database. It's going to be very hard for a new website to develop that database. There are links all over the internet to YouTube and to the movies on YouTube. That's something that's going to be very hard for a competitor to obtain. Probably take at least several years, at least 3 years, in order to obtain something like this. Also, because YouTube is so popular, it's become sort of a social internet. Everybody knows where to go to find good movies. People interact with each other, and it's going to be hard for somebody to migrate over to a new site if all their friends stay on YouTube. So there are a lot of things that's going to make it very difficult for someone to come into the market right now and compete effectively with YouTube. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I am saying it's difficult. Hopefully there may be competitors on the horizon that could force YouTube to become more responsive to its viewers. I don't see it likely to happen. I don't see immediate calls for the government to regulate YouTube. I don't see that as happening immediately. But as YouTube becomes more and more popular, as more and more people view it as the place to go, the place to get your voice heard, it's becoming more and more important in people's lives. And if people think that access to YouTube is so fundamentally important to get your message broadcast that they view it as a right rather than a privilege, that's when government may step in to regulate YouTube. We're not there yet, but I predict that as YouTube becomes more successful, and I'm sure YouTube wants that type of success, I'm sure that that is their goal, that everybody goes to YouTube as the place to go. As they get closer and closer to that success, you're going to have people perceive this as a right to be heard, a right to have a voice. Now, you and I and most people can't go out and afford to buy a full-page ad in the New York Times when they want to get our voice across. We don't have equal access to that. Only the rich have that access to that. But YouTube has become sort of a poor man's or poor person's broadcasting medium. Now, YouTube would and Google would argue, hey, it's free. The government shouldn't have right to regulate a free service, and I think that they have a pretty powerful argument there. After all, we're not buying the service. YouTube is offering it for free, and I'm not saying that government should regulate them. There's a pretty powerful counter argument to this. But despite the counter argument, I predict within the next 5 years, if YouTube becomes more successful, I think there's going to be a powerful movement to see the government regulation of YouTube. So, there you have it, Tony. Those are the parallels between your hoax and the War of the World. Well, this lecture by a masked man has gone on frighteningly long. Way too long already, so I think I'm going to end it here. This has been the Masked Analyst. Under and in.